We now set up this virtual environment and we logged in all those packages. Now it's time for some final steps or some final fine-tuning steps in the settings py file. Specifically, there is one very important option, the allowed hosts option, which we need to populate. Here in this list, we need to add all the hosts, so all the domains, which basically should be able to send requests to this Django application. With that, I don't mean the addresses of our users, but I mean the hosting address of the server which will host this application in the end. That's the better way of putting it. So here we need to enter the domain of the server we're going to host this application on. And often you already know this domain in advance, but often you also don't know it in advance. And that's why here I want to make sure that the concrete value here is actually only populated and only plugged into that file after deployment. And to do that, we can use a concept called environment variables. That allows us to use a placeholder here and then define a value for the given environment variable, so for that placeholder name, later. And that's a feature which is already built into Python. For that, we just need to import from the core OS module, and we import the getEnv function. This will then get the value of a so-called environment variable. And this environment has nothing to do with our virtual environment, by the way. This is a different concept. Environment variables are simply global variables which we can set for the context in which our application runs, and most hosting providers allow us to set such variables. Actually, all hosting providers, I would guess, support this feature. And this is also not a Python or Django exclusive feature. This is a feature which exists in programming in general. Basically, all programming languages and frameworks and so on know this concept of environment variables. So now with getEnv imported in allowed hosts, we can call getEnv, and now we pass in a string with any name of our choice, with any identifier of our choice, and I'll name it app host. But this is up to you. Later, once we deploy this, we'll just need to make sure that we provide a value for app host. Now, for the secret key, we can do something similar. We can keep it here in this settings py file, but you should be careful about that. If you keep it here, you should make sure that you don't expose it on GitHub, for example. If you don't plan on pushing your code to GitHub, you're fine, but you should simply make sure that you never expose it to others. If there is a danger of exposing it, you might want to use getEnv here as well, with some identifier like secret key, and plug in the concrete value for that key once you deploy your application. I'm not doing that here, but I want to put it out there so that you are aware of this option. So now with that, we also configured this. Now last but not least, for debug, we could have a similar concern. We might want to set this to false in production, but to true in development. So currently we always have to switch it manually. We could of course also get an environment variable here, and for example, check for a isProduction environment variable, and that should then pass in a value of true or false, and provide a default with the second argument here of, let's say, true, in case this environment variable is not set. So that during development, we simply don't set this environment variable, and hence we assume a value of true, and in production we do set it, and we then set it to false, and we're therefore fine as well. And that is something I will do here as well. And actually, just a short side note from Max from the future, actually this environment variable should better be named isDevelopment, not isProduction, because the default should be true, yes, but that only makes sense if we name it isDevelopment, because the default is that we're in development mode locally and we want to use true. Later, when we deploy this to production, I want to pass in a value of false so that debug is set to false, and therefore a name of isDevelopment makes more sense. I'll fix this in a couple of minutes in a separate lecture. I just already did want to mention it here. With that, we're done with the environment variables though. Now we got a settings file that is readily configured. Now let's dive into our specific hosting example. Let's dive into AWS.